And as this inner ease begins to settle deeper into awareness, I notice how quickly the body responds to even the subtlest shift in attention. There is a quiet intelligence within the human system that most people overlook, yet it is constantly listening, constantly adjusting, constantly reorganizing itself in response to thought and feeling. When I bring my focus to the heart region, I am not imagining something abstract. I am engaging a measurable field of activity that communicates with the brain in real time. This communication is not metaphorical, it is biological, electrical, and deeply coherent. When the system is in a state of ease rather than tension, in moments of stress, the signals become fragmented, like static in a transmission, but in inner ease, the signal strengthens and begins to organize perception differently. I observe that even a simple shift in breath can alter the rhythm of neural firing, creating a cascade effect that moves from the body upward into cognition. What we often call emotion is not separate from physiology. It is physiology in motion, shaped by memory, anticipation, and the ongoing interpretation of experience. When the heart and brain begin to synchronize, I notice a subtle but profound shift in perception, as though the mind expands its bandwidth for understanding reality. This synchronization is supported by feedback loops of the nervous system that continuously inform both centers, allowing coherence to emerge without force or effort. And when coherence emerges, the body no longer operates in survival mode alone. It begins to explore states of creativity, intuition, and expanded awareness. I find that this shift is not something I impose, but something I allow, as if the system already knows the path back to balance. The practice of inner ease becomes less about control and more about remembrance, a return to a natural state that has always been available beneath mental noise. In this state, I notice that thought no longer dominates experience. Instead, awareness begins to hold thought like a sky holding passing clouds. Over time, repeated practice reshapes the baseline of perception, and what once felt like effort gradually transforms into a natural resting coherence. The nervous system learns through repetition, and each return to this inner ease strengthens the pathways associated with regulation and emotional stability. I sometimes think of this process as tuning an instrument, where the heart provides the foundational rhythm and the brain refines the harmonic structure of experience. When these systems are aligned, perception itself becomes more transparent, less distorted by reactive patterns that once shaped interpretation automatically. And in that transparency, I begin to sense layers of awareness that were previously filtered out by habitual mental activity. This is where inner ease becomes not just a practice, but a lens through which reality is experienced more fully and less constrained by distortion. I remain aware that even subtle distractions can pull the system back into fragmentation, yet awareness itself provides the anchor that restores coherence. Each time I return, I am not starting over, but deepening an existing pattern of stability that continues to strengthen beneath conscious attention. The more I explore this terrain, the more I recognize that healing is not a destination, but a dynamic process unfolding moment by moment. And within that unfolding, I begin to sense that the boundary between observer and observed becomes increasingly subtle, almost imperceptible in direct experience. This subtlety invites a different quality of attention, one that is less about control and more about receptive awareness. I notice that in receptive awareness, thought arises and dissolves with less resistance, as if it is no longer fighting for dominance. The system becomes more fluid, more responsive, and less bound by rigid patterns that once dictated emotional and cognitive reactions. I begin to recognize that inner ease is not an absence of activity, but a reorganization of how activity is experienced. Even in moments of external complexity, this internal coherence can persist as a stable reference point within awareness. I observe that the brain does not merely react to the world, but actively predicts and constructs meaning based on prior patterns and current input. When those predictions are softened by inner ease, perception becomes more open, less constrained by expectation, and more attuned to present reality. I notice that this openness allows for subtle signals from the body to be noticed before they escalate into stronger emotional reactions. And as I continue to rest in this awareness, there is a growing sense that the heart is not just an organ, but a center of integration. It organizes information from multiple systems, synchronizing rhythm, emotion, and cognition into a unified field of experience. I begin to see that what we call healing may simply be the restoration of communication between layers of perception that were never truly separate. And in that restoration, the sense of self becomes less fixed, more dynamic, and increasingly responsive to subtle shifts in internal state. I notice that even the act of observing my own thoughts begins to influence the texture and pace of those thoughts themselves. This recursive quality of awareness suggests that consciousness is not passive, but actively participates in shaping its own experience moment by moment. And as I deepen into this understanding, I realize that the boundary between inner and outer experience is more fluid than I once assumed. I continue to observe how subtle shifts in attention can reorganize entire patterns of perception without any deliberate effort or force. And I remain with the sense that something deeper is emerging within awareness, something that feels both familiar and yet still unfolding. And as I continue to rest in this expanding field of inner coherence, I begin to notice how the space between thoughts becomes more alive, more responsive, almost as if it carries an intelligence that was always present but rarely perceived, guiding subtle adjustments in perception, emotion, and bodily rhythm, drawing attention deeper into a still unfolding awareness that continues to expand further. And as this awareness deepens even further, I begin to notice that the space between sensations is not empty at all, but filled with a subtle kind of intelligence that organizes experience before thought can fully define it. In this quiet interval, I sense that the body is communicating in layers that language can only partially describe. Yet the message is unmistakably present in feeling, rhythm, and tone. I observe how attention itself becomes a shaping force, not by effort, but by presence. Wherever I place awareness, coherence begins to gather like scattered fragments, slowly finding alignment within a larger pattern that was always there beneath the surface of perception. In this state, I no longer try to fix or change experience. Instead, I allow it to reveal itself. And in that allowance, something unexpected happens. The intensity of inner noise begins to soften, not because it is suppressed, but because it is no longer being reinforced by resistance. I notice that the heart rhythm feels more regular, more spacious, as if it is responding to a deeper cue beyond conscious control. The brain, in turn, seems to slow its urgency, no longer scanning the environment with the same fragmented vigilance, but instead resting in a broader field of awareness. This shift is subtle at first, almost imperceptible, yet it carries profound implications. It suggests that the human system is not fixed in its patterns, but continuously adaptable, continuously responsive to the quality of attention being brought into each moment. As I remain in this observation, I begin to sense that emotional states are not fixed identities, but transient configurations of energy moving through a highly intelligent system. When I stop identifying with them, they begin to move differently, less rigid, more fluid, more informative rather than overwhelming. There is a moment where I can feel the difference between being inside an emotion and being aware of it. That small shift changes everything. It creates space, and in that space, choice becomes available again. I begin to recognize that inner ease is not a passive state, but an active form of awareness that allows the system to reorganize itself without force. It is a kind of listening not only to thoughts, but to the deeper patterns underneath thought. In this listening, I notice that intuition becomes clearer, not as prediction, but as recognition of subtle patterns that were previously masked by mental noise. It feels less like knowing something new, and more like remembering something that was always accessible. The more I rest in this state, the more I realize that stress is not simply an external reaction, but a narrowing of perception. It compresses awareness into a smaller field where only certain signals are prioritized. Inner ease, by contrast, expands that field again, and in that expansion, I can sense more of what is happening within the body at once. Sensations that were once background become visible. Subtle shifts in temperature, pressure, and rhythm emerge into conscious awareness without overwhelming the system. I notice that breathing becomes less of an intentional act and more of a synchronized movement between body and awareness. It is as if the breath itself becomes the bridge between internal states and external reality. In this rhythm, there is no need to control the process. Control itself feels unnecessary when coherence begins to sustain itself. Instead, I find myself observing, participating, and receiving all at once. There is a profound simplicity in this state that contrasts sharply with the complexity of everyday mental activity, and yet it is not an escape from life, but a deeper entry into it, where each moment feels more complete, more present, more integrated. As I continue, I become aware of how memory behaves differently in this state. Instead of replaying as rigid narrative, it becomes more like a soft imprint, something that can be observed without being relived. This changes the emotional charge of past experiences. They no longer dictate present perception with the same intensity. They become information rather than identity. And in this transformation, I sense a form of healing that is not about fixing something broken, but about restoring communication between parts of the system that had become isolated through stress or repetition. I notice that the body responds quickly to this restoration. Muscles release tension without being told. The nervous system recalibrates its baseline. Even perception of time seems to stretch, becoming less urgent, more spacious. In this spaciousness, I begin to recognize that awareness itself is not located in any single part of the body, yet it permeates the entire experience of being alive. It is both the observer and the space in which observation occurs. This realization does not feel intellectual. It feels experiential, immediate, and quietly stable. It does not require belief, only attention. And as I remain here, I begin to sense that the practice of inner ease is less about achieving a state and more about remembering how to return to what is already present, beneath fluctuation. Even distraction becomes part of the process. When attention moves away, the return itself strengthens awareness, like a muscle developing through gentle repetition. I notice that judgment loses its intensity here. Experiences are no longer categorized as good or bad in the same automatic way. Instead, they are seen as movements within a larger system of intelligence unfolding in real time. And within that unfolding, I feel a growing recognition that I am not separate from the process being observed. The observer and the observed begin to merge in subtle ways that are difficult to define but easy to feel. This merging does not erase individuality but softens its edges, allowing experience to flow without rigid boundaries. As I continue to rest in this awareness, I begin to sense a deeper layer still unfolding beneath even this coherence, as if there is another level of intelligence waiting just beyond the threshold of perception, quietly inviting attention to go further without effort or expectation. And I notice that even this invitation is not something outside of me, but something arising from within the same field of awareness that has been present all along, gently shaping attention toward greater depth without demanding anything in return. As I allow myself to remain in this subtle openness, I begin to perceive that awareness is not static. It has a quality of movement that is not physical, yet undeniably dynamic. It expands, contracts, refines, and integrates in response to how fully I am willing to be present with experience as it is, without layering interpretation too quickly over raw sensation. In this movement, I sense that the mind is not a single entity, but a layered process. One layer reacts, another observes, and yet another seems to quietly coordinate between them, seeking coherence even when fragmentation appears. And when I rest in inner ease, I can feel these layers communicating more clearly, without distortion. There is a moment where I notice how quickly the system recalibrates when it is not interrupted by judgment. A sensation arises, and instead of being labeled immediately, it is simply felt. In that simple act of feeling, something begins to resolve itself naturally, as if recognition alone is enough to initiate balance. I observe that much of what we experience as emotional intensity is amplified by resistance, by the unconscious habit of pushing against what is already happening. When that resistance softens, intensity does not disappear, but it transforms. It becomes movement instead of pressure, information instead of burden. And in this transformation, I can feel the nervous system adjusting its tone. The subtle electrical patterns that underlie thought and emotion seem to settle into more rhythmic coordination, less fragmented firing, more coherent flow. It is as though different regions of the system are finally speaking the same language again. I begin to notice that the sense of self also shifts in response to this coherence. It feels less like a fixed point and more like a center of awareness that moves with experience rather than standing apart from it. This movement creates a different kind of stability, one that is flexible rather than rigid. As I continue, I become aware that attention has depth. There is surface attention, which moves quickly from object to object, and there is deeper attention, which does not move as quickly, but instead rests within the field of experience itself. When I settle into this deeper layer, perception changes in subtle but profound ways. Time itself feels less segmented. Moments are no longer broken into sharp divisions, but experience this continuous unfolding. This continuity allows the mind to relax its urgency because it is no longer trying to catch up with experience, but instead participating in it directly. I notice that in this continuity, thought becomes less intrusive. Thoughts still arise, but they no longer dominate the field. They become part of the environment rather than the center of it. This shift reduces internal conflict, not by eliminating thought, but by changing its relationship to awareness. There is a growing recognition that awareness is not something I create, it is something I return to. And each return strengthens familiarity with a state that was never truly absent, only overlooked through distraction and identification with mental activity. In this return, I begin to sense that the body itself holds memory in a very different way than the mind does. It does not narrate experience, it stores patterns of response. And when inner ease is present, those patterns can reorganize without needing to be consciously analyzed or understood. I observe how a subtle emotional imprint, once triggered, can dissolve more quickly when it is met with spacious attention rather than reactive interpretation. It is as if space itself is the most effective form of integration. And in that space, I can feel a quiet intelligence operating beneath all conscious effort. It is not separate from me, yet it is not controlled by me either. It feels more like an underlying order that becomes more apparent when interference is reduced. This recognition brings a different quality of trust into the experience. Not trust in an external idea, but trust in the inherent capacity of the system to reorganize itself when given the conditions of presence, patience, and non-interference. As I remain here, I notice that even subtle sensations in the body carry information. A tightening in the chest, a shift in the stomach, a slight change in breath rhythm. Each one reflects something being processed at a level deeper than conscious thought. Instead of interpreting these signals immediately, I simply allow them to be felt. And in that allowance, they begin to complete themselves like waves reaching shore and dissolving naturally, rather than being interrupted mid-motion. I find that this approach changes the entire relationship to discomfort. Discomfort is no longer something to escape from, but something to listen to, and when it is listened to without resistance, it often reveals its own resolution. There is a sense that the body is always striving toward balance, even when conditions appear chaotic. This striving is not forceful, it is intelligent adaptation, and when I align with it through awareness, I am participating in that adaptation rather than obstructing it. I begin to see that healing in this context is not a single event, but a continuous recalibration occurring moment by moment. It does not require dramatic change, it requires consistent presence. And as this understanding deepens, I notice that awareness itself feels increasingly spacious, not empty but open, capable of holding more complexity without becoming overwhelmed. In this openness, I can sense that perception is not fixed either. It is shaped by the quality of attention. When attention is narrow, perception is narrow. When attention is spacious, perception expands accordingly. This expansion does not create new reality, but reveals aspects of experience that were always present but not previously noticed. Subtle layers of sensation, thought, and emotional movement become accessible in a way that feels both new and familiar at the same time. And as I continue to rest in this unfolding field, I become aware that something deeper is still organizing itself beneath awareness, a quiet integration that does not announce itself but continues to build coherence in the background of every breath, every sensation, every moment of simply being present, drawing attention further into a more refined and still evolving state that remains open and unfinished. And I notice that even this unfinished quality is part of the same living process, as if awareness itself resists finality because it is always in motion, always reorganizing, always revealing another layer beneath what was previously understood. As I stay with this subtle unfolding, I begin to sense that coherence is not something that arrives fully formed, but something that is continuously built through micro adjustments in attention, emotion, and bodily response. Each moment becomes a small opportunity for realignment, not through effort, but through recognition. I observe how quickly the internal state responds when I stop trying to manage it. The moment management drops away, something more intelligent seems to take its place, guiding experience back toward equilibrium with a quiet precision that does not require language. There is a kind of intelligence here that feels older than thought, yet present within every thought. It does not compete with cognition, it underlies it. And when I become quiet enough internally, I can feel it operating like a background architecture, supporting everything that arises. In this awareness, I notice that even subtle emotional fluctuations are not random. They appear to follow patterns of accumulation and release, shaped by attention over time. What I focus on, even briefly, seems to leave an imprint that influences how the next moment unfolds. This makes attention feel less like a passive faculty and more like a creative force. Not in a mystical sense, but in a very direct experiential way. Wherever attention rests, structure begins to form, and wherever it withdraws completely, patterns begin to dissolve. As I continue observing, I become aware of how often the mind attempts to finalize meaning prematurely. It wants conclusions, definitions, certainty, but in this deeper state of inner ease, I notice that meaning is not fixed. It is fluid, emerging differently depending on the depth of awareness holding it. When I allow meaning to remain open, experience becomes richer. Not because more is added, but because less is filtered out. Subtle aspects of sensation and perception that were previously ignored begin to register more clearly in awareness. I begin to sense that the nervous system is not simply reacting to external reality, but continuously interpreting it through internal states that are constantly shifting. This means that perception itself is never neutral. It is always shaped by the internal condition of coherence or fragmentation. And when coherence increases, perception becomes less distorted by past conditioning. The present moment feels more direct, less layered with interpretation, more immediate in its rawness. It is as if a veil has become thinner, allowing more of reality to be experienced without automatic translation. I notice that in this directness there is a reduction in internal commentary. The constant narration of experience softens. Instead of describing life as it happens, I find myself simply being within it, with less separation between observer and experience. This reduction in commentary does not create silence in the mind, but a different relationship to mental activity. Thoughts still arise, but they are no longer treated as commands or absolute truths. They are experienced more like passing signals within a larger field. And in this field, I begin to recognize that emotional intelligence is not about controlling emotion, but about increasing the capacity to remain present with it, without fragmentation. Presence itself becomes the stabilizing factor, not suppression, not avoidance, but full engagement without resistance. I observe how the body responds to this kind of presence almost immediately. Muscle tension shifts subtly. Breathing becomes less restricted. Even posture seems to adjust itself without conscious correction, as if the system is naturally seeking alignment when not interrupted. There is a quiet beauty in this self-organizing quality. It suggests that balance is not something imposed from outside, but something intrinsic to the system when interference is reduced. My role is not to force alignment, but to stop disrupting it. As I remain in this awareness, I begin to sense that memory itself is more fluid than it appears. It is not stored as static data, but as living patterns that can be reactivated, reorganized, and even softened depending on the present state of coherence. When I revisit a memory in this state, it no longer carries the same emotional weight. It feels less like reliving and more like observing a trace of experience from a safe and spacious distance. This distance is not separation, but clarity. And in that clarity, I can feel how past experiences lose their grip on present identity. They become part of the landscape rather than the center of it. This shift allows more freedom in how the present moment is interpreted and experienced. I notice that the heart region, when brought into gentle awareness, acts like an anchor point for this coherence. not because it controls anything, but because it reflects the overall state of integration across multiple systems simultaneously. As attention rests there, I can sense subtle variations in rhythm and sensation that seem to correspond with shifts in emotional tone. These signals are not words, but patterns, and yet they communicate with remarkable precision when I am quiet enough to listen. In this listening, I begin to understand that healing is not linear. It does not move in a straight path from broken to fixed. Instead, it moves in cycles of recognition, integration, and expansion, each cycle revealing deeper layers of unresolved tension and greater capacity for coherence. And within each cycle, there are moments where nothing appears to be happening on the surface, yet underneath, subtle reorganizations are taking place that only become visible later through shifts in perception and emotional stability. I find that patience becomes an essential quality here, not as waiting for something to happen, but as allowing what is already happening at deeper levels to unfold without interference or premature interpretation. As I continue, I notice that even the sense of I becomes less rigid. It is no longer experienced as a fixed identity, but as a point of awareness moving through changing states of perception, sometimes expanded, sometimes focused, but always present in some form. This fluid sense of self does not create instability. Instead, it creates adaptability. There is less resistance to change because identity is not locked into a single configuration. It can shift without losing continuity. And in this adaptability, I begin to sense that the boundary between internal and external experience is becoming increasingly permeable. What I once considered outside now feels deeply connected to the internal field of perception, as if both are part of one continuous system of interaction and response. This recognition brings a subtle shift in responsibility, not responsibility as burden, but as awareness of participation. Every moment of attention, every emotional response, every interpretive choice contributes to the shaping of the experience being lived. And as I sit with this understanding, I feel that something deeper is still forming beneath awareness itself, a kind of integration that is not yet complete, continuing to gather coherence in ways that are not fully visible, yet beginning to influence the entire field of experience in a direction that remains open, unfolding, and still gently moving toward. And even as that direction remains unnamed, I notice that the mind has a natural tendency to want to define it, to give it shape, to turn the unknown into something familiar. But in this space, I allow it to remain undefined because I can feel that the undefined carries more information than any immediate conclusion could hold. There is a subtle shift that happens when I stop naming experience so quickly. The world does not become less clear. Instead, it becomes more detailed, more layered, as if perception itself gains resolution when it is not compressed into conceptual labels. I observe how sensations arise and dissolve with a kind of effortless rhythm, and I begin to sense that this rhythm is not random. It follows an underlying intelligence that organizes experience moment by moment, responding to attention like a living feedback system. When I place awareness on this process, I notice that nothing needs to be added. In fact, adding often disturbs the natural flow. The system already knows how to regulate itself when given space. My role becomes one of witnessing rather than directing. And in this witnessing, I begin to feel that the boundary between internal experience and external environment is even more fluid than I previously recognized. Sounds, sensations, thoughts, and emotions all arise within the same field, differentiated only by the way attention interacts with them. I notice that when attention is stable, experience becomes integrated. When attention is fragmented, experience feels divided. This suggests that coherence is not something achieved at a final stage, but something maintained through the quality of awareness in each passing moment. As I continue, I become aware of a deeper layer of perception that does not rely on interpretation at all. It is a direct sensing before language, before meaning. It is immediate and unfiltered, and yet it carries a sense of intelligence that is unmistakable. In this direct sensing, I notice that even subtle shifts in emotional tone can be perceived earlier than they usually would be. It is as if awareness is learning to detect the beginnings of movement within the system before they fully manifest. This early recognition changes everything. Instead of reacting after a state has fully formed, there is now an opportunity to be present at its origin point, where it is still flexible, still responsive, still capable of transformation without resistance. I find that this sensitivity does not create instability. On the contrary, it creates a deeper stability, because nothing builds to an overwhelming intensity before it is acknowledged. Everything is met at its earliest expression. And as I remain in this refined awareness, I begin to notice that thoughts themselves have texture. Some thoughts feel dense and repetitive, while others feel light and transient. The difference is not in content alone, but in the energy that carries them. When inner ease is present, even dense thoughts begin to lose their grip. They are still observable, but they no longer define the entire field of experience. They become localized events within a much larger and more spacious awareness. I observe that the nervous system seems to prefer this spaciousness. It does not need constant activation or vigilance. It naturally settles when it is not being continuously stimulated by internal narrative or external interpretation. There is a kind of intelligence in rest that is often overlooked. It is not inactivity, it is reorganization. In rest, the system integrates what has been experienced, aligning memory, sensation, and interpretation into more coherent patterns. And I begin to see that inner ease is not separate from this rest, but a conscious participation in it. It is awareness choosing not to interfere unnecessarily, allowing deeper processes to complete themselves without interruption. As I continue, I notice that emotional states begin to feel less like fixed conditions and more like waves moving through a vast field. They rise, peak, and dissolve, but the field itself remains unchanged, steady, and quietly aware. This recognition brings a profound shift in how experience is held. Nothing needs to be grasped or resisted in the same way. Everything becomes part of a larger unfolding that does not require control to remain coherent. I begin to sense that the heart and brain connection is not just a biological interaction, but a dynamic exchange of information that reflects the overall coherence of the entire system. When they are aligned, perception feels unified. When they are misaligned, experience feels fragmented. And yet, alignment is not something I force. It appears when attention is balanced, when breathing is natural, and when interpretation is softened. It is a state that emerges rather than a condition that is imposed. I notice that even subtle shifts in posture influence this alignment. The body seems to respond continuously to internal states, adjusting itself in micro-movements that reflect changes in emotional and cognitive tone. There is something deeply intelligent about this continuous adjustment. It suggests that the body is not separate from awareness, but an extension of it, constantly translating internal states into physical expression. As I remain with this understanding, I begin to feel that awareness itself is not located anywhere specific. It is not inside the head, not inside the chest, but present throughout the entire field of experience without boundary or fixed position. This distributed sense of awareness creates a different kind of identity. It is less localized, less confined, more spacious. Experience is still personal, but it is not isolated in the way it once seemed to be. I notice that this spaciousness allows for greater tolerance of complexity. Multiple sensations, thoughts, and emotions can arise simultaneously without creating internal conflict. They are simply held within a larger field that does not fragment under pressure. And in this holding, I begin to sense that even uncertainty has a place. It is not an error in the system, but part of its natural openness. Uncertainty allows for new patterns to emerge that would not be possible within rigid interpretation. I observe how quickly the mind tries to resolve uncertainty into certainty, yet here I allow it to remain unresolved, because I can feel that resolution is not always the goal. Sometimes openness itself is the most accurate state of awareness. As I stay with this openness, I notice that perception becomes more sensitive to subtle cues in the environment and within the body. Small changes in tone, rhythm, and sensation become meaningful in a way they were not before. It is not that meaning is imposed, but that meaning is recognized as already present in the relationship between awareness and experience. Nothing needs to be added for significance to be felt. And as this recognition deepens, I begin to sense that something is continuing to organize itself beneath all of this observation. A deeper coherence that does not announce itself, but gradually shapes the entire field of experience from within, guiding attention gently toward a state that feels increasingly unified, increasingly quiet, and yet still unfolding in ways that are not fully visible, as if the next moment is already forming just beyond the edge of awareness, waiting. And as I remain in that quiet edge of perception, I begin to notice that waiting is not really the right word for what is happening here. Nothing is waiting. Everything is already in motion, already responding, already alive in a continuous exchange that does not pause for interpretation. It feels more like I have stepped into a frequency of awareness where time is not ahead of me or behind me, but surrounding me as a living field of unfolding information. In this field, I notice that the nervous system is no longer reacting in the same old predictable loops. There is still response, but it is cleaner now, less entangled with memory-based projection. Each response feels more present-based, more appropriate to what is actually occurring, rather than what was previously expected. I begin to sense that expectation itself is one of the strongest filters shaping perception. When expectation is strong, the present moment is partially overwritten before it can fully be experienced. But in this state of inner ease, expectation loosens its grip and something more direct becomes available. It is almost as if reality becomes slightly more honest when I am not trying to predict it in advance. And in that honesty, I can feel subtle layers of emotional information that were previously too faint to notice. Not dramatic emotions, but microsignals, tiny shifts in internal tone that reveal how the system is orienting itself moment by moment. I notice that when I simply stay with these microsignals without interpreting them too quickly, they begin to resolve on their own. It is as if awareness itself provides the correction, not through force, but through presence. This makes me realize that many of the imbalances I once associated with emotional overwhelm were not fixed conditions, but incomplete processes, states that were interrupted before they could naturally complete their movement. And so I begin to understand healing less as fixing and more as allowing completion. As this understanding deepens, I become aware of a quiet shift in the way attention moves through the body. It is no longer jumping rapidly between points of discomfort or stimulation. Instead, it begins to settle into continuity, moving smoothly across sensations without fragmentation. In this continuity, even discomfort feels different. It loses its sharp edges and becomes more like a wave pattern, something that can be observed without resistance. And the moment resistance drops, the intensity itself begins to reorganize. I notice that the heart region, when gently attended, seems to act as a stabilizing anchor for this process, not because it controls anything, but because it reflects coherence in real time, like a mirror for the overall state of integration. Breathing naturally slows in response to this coherence. Not forced slowing, but spontaneous regulation. It feels as though the entire system is choosing efficiency over urgency. And in that efficiency, I sense a deeper intelligence at work, one that does not rely on language or thought to coordinate balance. It simply operates when conditions allow it to operate freely. I begin to see that inner ease is not something I enter and leave, but something I either allow or interrupt. It is always available in the background, waiting for attention to stop interfering with its natural expression. As I stay here longer, I notice that thoughts about identity begin to soften. The sense of who I am becomes less rigid, less defined by story, and more connected to the simple fact of awareness itself. There is still individuality, but it feels more like a point of perspective within a much larger field, rather than a separate entity standing apart from everything else. This shift changes how experience is interpreted. Events no longer feel like they are happening to me in the same way. They feel like movements within a shared field that includes perception, emotion, and environment all at once. And in this shared field, I begin to notice a subtle coherence linking internal and external experience. A thought arises, and the environment seems to reflect it in tone. A feeling shifts, and perception of space subtly changes with it. Not in a supernatural sense, but in a perceptual sense, because awareness is the common medium through which all experience is filtered. I begin to sense that the brain is not generating reality, but organizing incoming information into a usable model of reality. And when inner coherence increases, that model becomes less distorted, more responsive, more aligned with what is actually present. As this becomes clearer, I notice that the urge to control experience diminishes. Control is replaced by participation. Instead of trying to direct every outcome, I find myself engaging with what is already unfolding in real time. This participation feels more intelligent than control ever was because it includes more information than the conscious mind alone could process. And as I rest in this participation, I begin to feel a deeper stillness beneath all movement. Not a frozen stillness, but a foundational quiet that remains unchanged regardless of what is happening on the surface. It is from this stillness that everything seems to arise and return. Thoughts, sensations, emotions, perceptions, they all appear to move through it rather than exist apart from it. I notice that even attention itself eventually returns to this stillness when it is not engaged in effortful focus. It naturally relaxes back into its origin point, like a wave returning to the ocean. And in that return, there is a sense of completeness that does not require explanation. Nothing needs to be resolved in order for this completeness to be present. It is already here, beneath all unresolved layers of experience. As I remain in this recognition, I begin to sense that something deeper is still unfolding, not outside of awareness, but within it, quietly continuing to reorganize perception in ways that are not yet fully visible, as if the next layer of understanding is already forming just beyond the edge of what can currently be perceived, drawing everything gently forward into a more refined state of coherence that continues to open.
When we step back from the language of meditation and enter the deeper structure behind what was being described, something important becomes clear. What I was pointing toward is not a mystical experience reserved for rare moments of calm, but a very real and measurable shift in how the human nervous system organizes itself through attention, emotion, and perception. At the center of this understanding is a simple idea. The body is constantly responding to the quality of consciousness you bring into each moment. Not just your thoughts, but the tone behind your thoughts. That tone, whether it is rushed, peaceful, fragmented, or coherent, acts like a signal that shapes physiology in real time. To understand this, imagine your nervous system as a vast communication network. The brain is not a dictator issuing commands. It is more like a central coordinator, receiving feedback from every part of the body. The heart, the gut, the breath, all of these systems are continuously sending information upward while the brain sends regulatory signals downward. When this communication is smooth, you experience what researchers often call coherence. In simple terms, coherence means your internal systems are working in sync rather than competing with each other. It is similar to an orchestra tuning before a performance. When each instrument is slightly out of rhythm, the sound feels chaotic. But when they align, even simple notes become deeply harmonious. Now apply this to your emotional life. When you are stressed, your attention becomes narrow and fragmented. You are not fully present with what is happening. Instead, your mind is predicting, replaying, or resisting. This creates what we can think of as internal noise. In biological terms, this noise is reflected in irregular heart rhythms, shallow breathing, and heightened stress hormones. But when you shift into inner ease, what the script described as a state of gentle awareness without resistance, something remarkable happens. The nervous system begins to synchronize, breathing slows naturally, heart rhythms become more ordered, brain activity becomes less chaotic and more integrated. This is not imagination, it is physiology responding to attention. A simple way to understand this is to think of your attention like a tuning knob. When attention is scattered, the system is detuned. When attention is steady and calm, the system gradually retunes itself into balance. You are not forcing this change, you are creating the conditions for it. One of the most important insights from neuroscience is that the brain is predictive. It is constantly trying to guess what will happen next based on past experience. This is efficient, but it also creates a limitation. You may not actually be experiencing the present moment. You may be experiencing a prediction of it. This is where inner ease becomes powerful. When you reduce internal resistance, you reduce predictive distortion. You begin to perceive reality with less filtering. It is similar to cleaning a fogged up window. The outside world does not change. The clarity of perception changes. Now let's bring this into everyday life. Imagine you are in a conversation and someone says something emotionally triggering. In a reactive state, your nervous system immediately activates, heartbeat increases, thoughts accelerate, and interpretation becomes defensive. You are no longer responding to the person, you are responding to a physiological stress pattern. But if you have trained even a small degree of inner ease, something different becomes available. Instead of instantly reacting, you notice the rise of sensation in the body first. That gap, even if it is just a few seconds, is everything. In that gap, choice appears. This is what people often call emotional intelligence, but at a biological level, it is simply increased nervous system coherence under pressure. Another key idea from the script is that emotions are not fixed states, they are processes. They move through the body like waves. When they are resisted, they intensify. When they are allowed, they complete. Think of it like holding a beach ball underwater. The more force you use to suppress it, the more energy it builds. Eventually, it bursts upward. Emotional suppression works the same way. Inner ease removes the pressure grip and allows the wave to complete naturally. This has profound implications for healing and mental well being. Many chronic emotional patterns are not permanent conditions. They are incomplete cycles that never fully resolved because attention moved away too quickly or became defensive. Now, let's connect this to the heart brain relationship. The heart is not just a mechanical pump. It generates a powerful electromagnetic field and sends continuous feedback signals to the brain through the nervous system. When heart rhythms are coherent, smooth, ordered, and stable, the brain receives a stabilizing signal that influences perception, decision making, and emotional regulation. This is why practices that focus on heart centered awareness often produce rapid calming effects. You are not thinking differently, you are changing the input signal the brain is receiving. A practical way to apply this is simple. Place attention gently on the area of the chest, not with effort, but with curiosity. Then slow the breath slightly without forcing it. Allow the exhale to become longer than the inhale. Within a short time, you will notice subtle shifts in internal state. This is the beginning of physiological coherence. But the deeper layer of this practice is not technique, it is relationship. The relationship you develop with your inner experience determines whether your system contracts or expands. If you treat discomfort as an enemy, you create internal conflict. If you treat it as information, you create integration. This shift alone can change how you experience anxiety, frustration, and even physical tension. Another important concept from the script is the fluidity of identity. Most people experience themselves as a fixed self moving through time. But in deeper awareness, identity becomes more like a shifting perspective within experience. This matters because rigidity of identity is often what amplifies suffering. When you think, I am anxious, the experience becomes solidified. But when you shift to anxiety is present in awareness, something subtle changes. You are no longer trapped inside the state, you are observing it. That small shift restores flexibility to the system. So, how do we apply all of this in daily life in a practical way? Here are grounded, usable steps. First, practice micropauses throughout the day. Before responding to messages, speaking in conflict, or making decisions, pause for one breath. This interrupts automatic reactivity and reintroduces awareness into the system. Second, train body awareness. Several times a day, scan for sensation without trying to change it. This builds the skill of observing without resistance, which is the foundation of inner ease. Third, soften interpretation. When something happens, notice how quickly the mind assigns meaning. Then gently step back and ask, what do I actually feel in the body right now, before the story? Fourth, use breath as a reset point. Extended exhale, breathing naturally signals safety to the nervous system, shifting it out of stress activation and toward coherence. Fifth, reduce internal urgency. Much of modern stress comes not from external events, but from the internal pressure to resolve everything immediately. Allow some experiences to remain unfinished without forcing closure. When these practices are repeated consistently, something subtle but profound begins to happen. The baseline of your nervous system shifts. You become less reactive, not because life changes, but because your internal system becomes more stable. And this stability is what allows clarity, emotional resilience, and deeper perception of life as it actually is, not as it is filtered through stress. What we ultimately discover through this process is that inner ease is not a technique you perform. It is a return to a natural state of coherence that is always available beneath mental noise. And as we continue exploring this, we begin to see that what we call healing, awareness, and even personal growth may all be different expressions of the same underlying movement toward integration that is already happening within you moment by moment, even now,